Right. Um, okay, so welcome to public space or the commons. Um, so, like I said, we will be discussing various aspects of public space, what kind of makes public space, and how that has changed and what the current definitions are, and what commons are and how that is different, and what our present and future challenges will be like. Challenges will be like. So, just to give you a bit of background about what we do, we are CoLab. Our approach believes in the power of the collective. So, what we do is that we have a network of designers, experts, artists, researchers, etc., whom we kind of collaborate with on different projects. And the idea is that no project, whether it's research, whether it's interior design, whatever it is, no project is kind of done with only one person making the decisions. So we kind of, this whole People for Cities initiative is also a kind of way of generating this kind of public network so that members of the public can also get involved in the kind of projects that we hope to do in the near future with respect to the urban realm. So, in our first section, we will be kind of defining what a public space is, what is the distinction between private, public, and the commons, what are the factors that influence public space, and who kind of controls public space and your behavior or activity within them. So, public space, there are two words there. So, does it public generally means that a group of people is the simplest explanation you can have for public? So, do you just mean a space where people can be? There is a very sort of simplistic definition of public space, which says that public space is anywhere that has public access. Now, how do you define what a public is, and how do you kind of define what their impact on space is? Like, for example, when you have a number of people inhabiting a space, they don't inhabit the space as sort of passive observers of the space. They are constantly using the space, and by using the space, they are kind of renegotiating the use of that space, their relationship with other people within the space. So there are multiple things that can influence this, such as a person's social status, your racial background, your sexual qualities, etc. I mean, sexual identity, etc., etc. So to that end, we are going to start by defining what these sort of factors that impact. Sorry. Yeah, so we're going to start by exploring what parts of an individual's identity can affect their use of public space. So I would ask you to kind of head to www.menti.com and enter the code 583169. And yeah, you can kind of have your say in what you think the factors are. Right, physical ability for sure, sense of togetherness, So we'll give it about a minute for all these responses to come in. Gender, yes. Their way of thinking, so that might be your ideologies. Please do keep it coming. We'll give it another 30 seconds. Socioeconomic background, awareness, age for sure, ownership, okay, ability again. Um, if they belong to a particular community, that's very important. Um, all right, so I think we can wrap up. Okay, a couple more coming in. All right. So I think we generally have a good idea of, how our behavior in public space might change with regards to maybe our race, caste, also wealth, our religious backgrounds. I'm just listing a few that aren't here as yet, but your political ideologies, your language, like someone said here, the way of thinking. So any kind of prejudices you might have towards other communities or other sections of society. So yeah, these are some important factors that we need to kind of factor into our definitions of public space. So now I'm just going back to the presentation. Right. So we spoke about the human aspect of space. Now, how you feel in that space. So we so far identified how our reaction to the space, uh, like what are our sort of things in the back of our head that might define whether we're allowed into a certain space or not, or sections of our, like for example, if you go into a clean and so-called sanitized kind of space like a mall, you might not find that all sections of the society are allowed there. Whereas when you go to a beach, there is no sort of um, no one can actually be barred from entry there, though the government does find ways and means of doing those things as well. So we kind of identified what certain factors that might affect your experience of public space may be. So this includes whether you feel like you belong in the space, so that sense of space, place, or ownership, whether that the buildings in that surrounding that space, for example, are something you are familiar with, that are kind of from your local conditions. Safety is important, especially as women. We tend to avoid dark spaces. You know, then there is activity. If there is activity happening in the space, you tend to kind of feel more safer than in an empty space. Then ease of access. So like I said, not everyone can be, are allowed into every public space there is. So based on all these factors, I'd like you to think along the lines of which communities may be included and which may be excluded in different public spaces, why this kind of inclusion exclusion happens, who decides the rules of using such a space, and what are the conditions, that is, what are the rules pertaining to your behavior in these spaces. So if we had to categorize, urban spaces into different types, we can kind of do that by in terms of ownership or use. So we have private spaces, we have privately owned public spaces, and we have public spaces, and we also have something called as the commons, which I will get into a little later. So private spaces are typically owned by individual people or corporations. The use of this kind of space is very specific to the owning, the people who own the space, or their sort of associates or members of their own communities. So you don't find outsiders in these spaces typically, and then the kind of rules are dictated by the individual owners or their community members, rather it will be dictated by the owners simply because they have complete ownership of the space. So those rules are imposed on other people using the space. Now, privately owned public spaces are typically like your malls and theaters and other places like that, where these spaces are increasingly privatized. This is a rather recent phenomenon from the 20th century, where we see all these malls, airports are overtaken by signage, advertising different people who are sponsoring spaces or who are they are the owners of, they are maintaining and developing um, these kind of public spaces in place of the government. So in this case, the spaces are controlled by the individual corporations which own these public spaces. Now, since there is all this kind of signage and kind of promotion that goes on in this space, there is a possibility that these spaces, the people who kind of own these spaces, impose their personal interests, private interests in terms of promoting their brands on the space. And they also kind of program your behavior. Like, for example, if you were in a mall, um, large signage announcing, sales, kind of program your behavior within that space to promote the interests of um, those shopkeepers and in turn the owners of that mall. Now, public spaces typically, like city libraries, town halls, etc., are owned by governments. The use of space is dictated by the government body. Here, the collective behavior is kind of restricted by the freedom of the collective. So you cannot do anything that infringes upon the freedom of the other person. There is a necessity to behave in a certain way, and these spaces are typically typically face high levels of surveillance, and you are definitely subjected to the rule of law here. So there are very real implications if you don't kind of follow the rules that have been established. So, like I said, on your left are private spaces like maybe restaurants, private clubs. These are not, these are very exclusive spaces. Then you have your privately owned public spaces like amusement parks, where you are programmed to behave in a certain way. And then you have public spaces like libraries, where there are certain rules to be followed, but for the most part, nobody is infringing upon your freedom. Neither are you allowed to infringe upon another's freedom. So right now, I would request you to go back to menti.com and enter the same code so that we can have a discussion about which spaces are private and which are public and so on. I've laid out a number of eight actual public spaces in terms of, sorry, the one on the left is supposed to say private, and on the right is supposed to say public. Yep. All right. So you kind of have an idea of what places would be seen as private and what would be seen as public. So within each of these spaces, for example, if you were in a mall, you would need to be able to kind of be able to pay for a parking ticket at the very least. Um, right. So at the very least, you would have to be able to pay for a parking ticket, or you would have to pay for a meal. You have to pay for any items that you may purchase. Opera houses typically from the 19th century have this kind of class system that was imposed upon them. That's why you have certain seats which are more expensive and closer to the stage, while you have seats at the back that cost a lot lesser. So there is a privileging of the kind of experience you can have in those spaces um, based on how much you can pay. Now, I see that many people have said that beaches and possibly parks and streets are completely public spaces. But at the same time, there is also the possibility, especially in Indian cities, like, for example, with Chennai, when the Jallikattu protests happened, there was that kind of instance where they shut off beaches to the public because they were scared, like the government was scared that people might hold protests there. um, Again, at the time of Corona, we don't really find access to the beaches that commonly. Sometimes they're shut, sometimes they're open. It's unpredictable. So, in a city that does not really have a lot of open space, our access to the limited resources that we have are very limited. So, I would say that even beaches and parks are not that kind of completely public spaces. All right, so I'm going to go back to the presentation now. Right. So we've already discussed privately owned public and public spaces. Now we're going on to a different concept, which is called the commons. Here, the ownership of the piece of land on which these um, resources are created or maintained does not matter. It can be private land or public land, it doesn't matter, because most of these urban commons are based on the process of appropriation. So people kind of, members of a community might come together and take over an urban space and transform it for the purposes of their community. So, for example, the bottom right of your screens is um, the austerity movement, anti-austerity movement in Spain. So there was this large square in Madrid, which was completely taken over by members of the public, and these 10 structures were put up where people kind of created their own form of governance within the area so that they could live and eat and do other activities within the space. And this occupation of space was in itself a movement. Here, so the resources and responsibility within such an urban space um, is shared by different members of the community. Here, the collective is the most important. Here, an individual doesn't make decisions. The collective needs to come together, and through mutual support, a conflict, negotiation, communication, experimentation, they make these decisions. All right. So here, the idea behind doing this is to reclaim control of urban life from public authorities and private markets, and instead hand the control back to individual citizen groups or communities. Now, there is this concept known as tragedy of the commons, where there are many people who argue that, you know, if resources are handed directly to the public without any kind of governmental control, uh, people will abuse the resources they are given to and exploit. Um, Again, I don't want you to think of commons as only a piece of land or a garden or something like that. Commons includes other tangible and intangible things like water, you know, clean air, climate, um, your digital commons that you find. All these are classed under commons, but we're specifically talking about urban commons here. So the concept of tragedy of the commons is that there are some who believe that people are not capable of regulating themselves and require a governmental agency to do that regulation. But there are many such examples around the world which have been sustained, like I said, by acts of mutual support, conflict, negotiation, communication, and experimentation. So all these activities require strong social relationships between the members of the community, which are built in this process of creating um, this common space or common resource, which are shared by these people. So we're moving on to the next section of our presentation, during which we will kind of discuss this relationship of public space with state and civil society, and also see how the introduction of this free market system in the world that is prevalent in the world right now, how that kind of introduction impacted public space. So in any kind of society, there is a relationship that needs to be maintained between the state and civil society. Now, this might be through direct, it might be as direct as, you know, one-on-one conversations, or like community negotiations, consultation processes, etc. Or it might be something like voting, where there is a necessity for this civil society and state to come together for different activities. Now, the introduction of this of neoliberalism. So, neoliberalism is a philosophy that advocates for the free market system. So, this introduction of this market as a buffer between the state and civil society, between governments and people like you and me, has meant that they have kind of taken on many of the responsibilities of the government, of the state, because suddenly we have these public spaces which have been kind of started being regulated by private players, but they are still considered as public space. So when this insertion of the market happens, then there is definitely a need for promoting their personal interests. And by this kind of process, there is a separation of state and civil society, with the markets making the most profit out of this kind of situation. So this kind of separation means that what we say doesn't go through to the government perfectly well. What the government wants to do doesn't come down to us very well. And both parties kind of end up acting in a way that benefits the market system. So the governments might announce, tax-free schemes and uh, economic policies that kind of benefit the free market system. At the same time, through our consumerist behavior, we kind of tend to, for example, fast fashion. Every other month, we go and buy clothes from these huge global conglomerates, but who is it actually benefiting? That is something we need to think about. And when this kind of structure happens, then we see that our public spaces are increasingly a version of the billboard, where you just go as a consumer of public space rather than an actor or a user of public space. Here, the idea is that you're not really welcome without your credit card. So that's something that is a phenomenon across most parts of the world. Now, there are places like Russia and China where there is supposed to be this kind of within the socialist ideology, there is supposed to be this heightened interaction between state and civil society. But the problems, there are problems there as well, where there is no separation of state and civil society, and kind of the state completely imposes their ideologies on general members of the public. So there is some kind of lapse in this relationship and what it is supposed to do for the public. So in terms of cities, now you're looking at a medieval plan of Paris, right? So this city had a lot of winding streets, these smaller scale streets where it's not always possible to kind of know what's happening on the other side. It's not built on a grand scale, as grand as we see today. So at the time of Napoleon Bonaparte, we saw what was Haussmann. Haussmann is a planner, a French planner, and this is the city that he came up for France. So if you notice this plan, there is something very sort of apparent here. You see a lot of these large squares or public areas. And you see these long and wide streets that kind of connect these large squares. So the idea behind these wide streets and these large public spaces is not only to beautify the city or to give it a particular image. This widening of these streets is meant to separate certain sections of the society from other sections of the society. So originally, the working class people used to live in the center of Paris. But through this plan, Haussmann's idea was to push them out onto the periphery and have more people from the middle class and from the upper classes inhabit the center of the city. There was, of course, a rebellion of sorts there was a rebellion of sorts through the Paris Commune, and this was reversed at the time. But even now, if you go to the city, it's largely a tourist-driven experience in the center of the city. At the same time, this width of the street and these long, wide streets and straight streets are meant to make sure that people can be looked at all times. There is a lot of surveillance that went into the planning of the city. The need for surveillance is central to the city. All right. Okay, what's happening? All right, we're back. So the next city that we kind of want to discuss is my own home city of Chennai. Um, so what happens here? This is a street called Pycroft's Road in Triplicane in Chennai, and this is largely what it used to look like at the beginning of the colonial era and before that as well. So you can see that this is a much more human scale of space where people can interact with each other. There were these sort of little sitting areas in front of houses where people could interact with their neighbors. So there was this really vibrant social life that people had in the city. Now, cut to the colonial era, you can already see a change happening in terms of how the city is used. You can see for sure that the road has been widened now. You see transport happening on the streets. You see some kind of colonial structure here. So there is some kind of surveillance from government authorities. And you don't see as much activity as you did during the pre-colonial era. And now this is Pycroft's Road right now. So what you see here is definitely an Indianized version of the neoliberal kind of agenda. So what you see here are a lot of these hoardings and signages, and it's a mall on a street. Yeah, it's where you go and you see all these signage, and you're attracted to go into these different shops. And people don't really pause here to talk to each other. It's either you walk, you shop, or you try to avoid being overrun by vehicles. So this kind of city, does it really work for its people? And does it really allow a citizen to express their views? And this is a street again, but who does it belong to? So in the final section of our little presentation, I'm going to be talking about the contemporary challenges that we face right now with the kind of boom of the internet and other forms of media, as well as this present situation we find ourselves in, which is the coronavirus outbreak. So to start with, we live in an increasingly virtual world. There is no denying it. And in fact, the internet is almost a metaphor for what public space is. It allows for a multiplicity of voices to be heard. There is no real filtering of what you can say on the internet, which is both good and bad. There is also a kind of connection to different parts of the world. So this interconnectedness allows for global networks to be formed. And it's no coincidence that so many protests and global movements have been made possible in this present era, because there is a lot of mobilization of action that needs to take place, that goes on these sort of social networks like Twitter, Facebook. You have all these events which go out, which allow us to kind of mobilize action. However, we still see the need for urban space to make ourselves heard. Even though we have this constant flow of real-time information, there is this need for face-to-face assembly in order to make decisions, or in order to actually be visible making change. Because as isolated pods around the world, sitting in our own living rooms and kind of making our own decisions and voicing it out on the internet, we haven't seen that translate into actual real change. So it's become almost like the internet is the staging ground for actual public space and actual citizen action. So while we tend to kind of stay in our houses and do most of our activities these days on the internet, there is still the need to create and sustain public space in our cities. And talking about the current crisis that we are facing, it's interesting because there is a continued need for public space, right? especially in areas where where there is limited access to public space, we see that the outbreak is more intense. Now, there was an interesting bit of information that I saw that Manhattan has a much lower rate of coronavirus outbreaks than many other densely populated parts of New York. This is possible because there are large open spaces in and around the area, and also because these areas are inhabited largely by working class or upper class individuals who are largely working from home, and they don't really need that space as much. But if you look at areas like the Bronx, where there is a sizable black and brown population, you might not have the same level or same amount of public space per person, but the density is much higher. And the fact that the access to public space is limited, it actually creates more trouble for people there. Why this is because outdoor areas might be safer for most activities like exercise, like you know, walking, yoga, whatever, a few outdoor concerts or dining and so on. So the large expanses of land allow you to maintain social distancing and at the same time carry out activities. This is not possible within a closed restaurant to the same degree, for example. So there is definitely a necessity for outdoor spaces, public spaces in such a time. But it's important to know that there is a reprogramming of public behavior that needs to take place, because especially in countries like India, where we already have limited public space, we need to kind of reprogram how we use the city, because we cannot, there is a need to promote the health or the well-being of the collective in order to protect the self. It's no longer a case of I can be safe myself and let the world go to hell, but that's all I need to protect. It's myself only. But unless you offer the same kind of safety to other people in the public, the virus might still find its way back to you. So there is that weird sense where you need to be respectful of the freedom of the collective if you want to maintain your own personal freedom. So this may be done through, this basic thing which has happened all around the world, where socially distant squares or circles or whatever are put out in public spaces to make sure this social distancing is maintained. Or you see, this is a street market in Malaysia, if I'm not wrong, where people have made sure that there's enough space and the shopping activity can still go on. Your daily fruits and veg, you can still go and get it outside. And this is far more safer than going to a grocery store and picking up your daily needs. So we also do see a further transition towards being more local, because these kind of shiny, sanitized spaces that we were dependent on are suddenly closed and not accessible to us. So it's a reversal of the scenario that we've been witnessing in the past 20, 30 odd years. So in this time, I think there is a necessity to kind of change the way we think of planning cities in the future, because there is a need to create more resilient cities, not only in terms of disease outbreaks, but the climate emergency is a necessity. Inequality in planning practices is also something we need to look at. So all these factors need to be looked at while planning the future of cities. So yeah, there is a need to be much more comprehensive in our planning of public spaces and cities, so that we can kind of prevent or at least better manage these kinds of outbreaks and other emergencies in the present and in the near future. So that is the end of this presentation. I'm going to stop. You can contact me at pritika@colab.in if you have any questions or if you have any further thoughts that you want to put across to me. So please do get in touch. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen now so that we can have so that we can have a more open conversation. So I would request all of you to kind of unmute yourselves. And we can have a quick discussion. So if everyone's unmuted now, can we have a quick discussion about, what kinds of public space do you actually go to and what your experience of these spaces are and how, yeah, so if we could just start with that. Anyone?
Can go.
Okay.
So yeah, so I think, like you said, first of all, thank you for the presentation. It was quite amazing. Like, yeah, I think you brought out all the important points that we sort of need to focus on as people belonging to a city, is using public space very prominently, sort of. And then I think personally, I think being from Chennai, like you said, we hardly have any public space that we prominently go to. Like the beach being one of the places, I feel like that is very prominently used. You see most people there. It's pretty, like, it's the attraction that the city has as a whole. Yeah. But then I feel like we haven't really made use of the space like we should. Like it's a picnic spot, yeah, but then it's like that's all it is. But that whole road, it has so much more potential to sort of develop into like a square sort of. We don't have a square in the city, for an example, but that would be a perfect space for a square.
Right. So whether or not a square is the perfect sort of localized solution to public spaces, I hear what you mean, because there is the beach, very narrow strip of pedestrian space. I mean, compared to the rest of the city, it's better, but as a public space, that doesn't really work.
It doesn't work.
And then there is just vigorous vehicular activity that goes
exactly. Yeah.
So in that sense, there is not enough scope to kind of have sit down and have a discussion. It's mostly people restricted to their own groups.
Exactly. Like I see that even like the like India Gate, like where Delhi protests happen. So it's like, like I think it's a pretty cool place. Yeah, Shaheen Bagh. So there it's pretty cool for all the protests, and I feel like it's sort of like they have something where people can go to for these kind of like gathering for like public.
Yeah, there are places like Jantar Mantar.
Yeah, exactly. So that's something we sort of lack as a city. And like you said, like most of these public spaces sort of become like a consumerist like attraction for people. Like you go there, you can't do anything if you're not buying something or you're not eating some food. That's like, there's no, and I think as a city, there's no activity only that's encouraged, which sort of lets you go to these places and interact as a public, as just general public. Yeah. So I think that's something I would like to maybe change, because it's one of the few places that we love going to. I think the beach.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So have you ever been to any kind of public space that might encourage social interaction?
I can't remember any such space right now, but then I think most of the places I've been to as a public space has mostly been, again, very consumerist, where you do buy stuff, where you do go there. You can't, like, you're not really having fun unless you're sitting in a restaurant and eating some food out of it, or you're spending money, basically. It's nothing. So I think what maybe what I really liked could be like I like the Dili Hut. I think
Right.
when I went there, but then again, that's again consumerist. It's not really like you're not really
Yeah,
like
but it's consumerist in a different way in that it kind of promotes local.
it promotes local craft. Yeah.
It
So
promotes local
that's
craft on one side, and it doesn't function only as a market space. There is like an auditorium area. There is a lot of
right,
space to walk, and you
right.
don't need to like fulfill some criteria to be there. Although I'm sure there are many issues that we don't know of because
Probably, yeah.
we're not from Delhi. But
yeah.
Yeah,
But it's definitely a closest example to something that's more public and interactive at the same time, which
right.
sort of where, you know.
Right. Anyone else? Have you been to any public space that you feel promotes or allows for social interaction?
I'm not sure about public interaction, but I think speaking of Chennai, though, and I know the beach, Marina Beach, is like a major attraction, and it's a common topic of discussion when we discuss public space in Chennai. But I feel something that is overlooked as part of, I guess, Chennai city life is the park culture. There are so many small and medium-sized parks throughout the city, which I guess if you look at like even the layout of T Nagar and stuff like that, the parks were designed into the urban fabric of each residential layout, which I guess at some point during the 1950s or 60s was just like eliminated um, in terms of land prices and trying to develop more efficiently to get more out of each neighborhood, I guess. But then it's fascinating, to just develop as much as you can to get the most out of that specific area. But I guess it's fascinating to kind of look at that aspect of Chennai life as well, because the parks that do exist in each community are super actively used. At least at least the big ones like Nageshwara Park, but there is a lot of usage, and I feel that's something that like, I just find that fascinating because you never associate it with our climate and.
Yeah, definitely. And also, neighborhood level public spaces, I feel, are a lot more successful in catalyzing any kind of change or interaction or just, day-to-day activities.
Oh, no, absolutely. Yeah.
Because they're much more human in scale. They're not these vast spaces where people just come and, it's not a culture of going to places to look at people or to have people look at you and how you behave and or just spend on certain things or not and so on and so forth. There's nothing imposed on you. So that is definitely interesting. But also another point is that this was a city of vibrant public spaces. There was the riverfront at some point. There were 1,000 lakes in this city at some point. But unfortunately, again, this free market capitalistic society that we live in promotes this ownership of land as this very important commodity, and which has meant that the kind of development that we see in the city is rather haphazard and bordering on the illegal, or actually illegal in many cases, but not specifically said that way. But you see a lot of these public spaces that were there at one time, which had been eroded away within half a century, I would say, which is quite fast. Yeah.
Right.
So interesting. That's an interesting thing to look at, and it would be also really cool to kind of appropriate different parks and kind of see how you can make those parks work better for the residents in the area. Or maybe you could appropriate parking lots and create parks for people,
right?
So on and so forth.
Mapping out those ideologies would be fascinating across the city, across the timeline.
There's also another space that I'd like to maybe talk about, because Chennai has this Pongal fair that comes up around Pongal every time, and it's basically aimed at the lower economic group mostly. And but the idea of it, of how it's done up, It's pretty cool because you have like all these it's open only for like 3-4 months in a year around Pongal time, and you have all these rides for kids. You have these information booths about different government agencies, and it's a very meager ticket, you know. That's really cheap. It's like anyone can go, like you don't have to really be really wealthy to afford a trip to the place and all that. So most people come there with their kids. They have like these food stalls. It's like, you know, very reasonable. People can pick up stuff that they want. You can buy things that are affordable, but and at the same time, there are also like, that's the thing, you have a lot of information, like these booths there that they put up, like, so people even who like, it's for everyone. But the thing I feel is, there again it limits how it's been like put up. The aesthetics is very bad. For an instance, like you wouldn't go there, like, you know, you don't feel good being in that place, even though it's like this crowd, there's like, you know, there's a lot of there's a lot of energy, but there is no effort in making it aesthetically pleasing or anything, like, you know, like it's like in.
Right.
So that's where I think the problem comes in, when it's something like this, if they pay attention to a space like this, make it even year long. Don't put it up for 4 months. You can make it year long, but pay attention to how the place is designed, how the planning is worked out. I mean, it can be a really nice place for everyone to go to. It doesn't have
Exactly.
to, you know, like, you know,
So this kind of like promoting it as for one particular class of society.
Exactly. They've marginalized the whole thing.
Yeah, and also if you this kind of separation of society spatially within a city also catalyzes a sense of prejudice towards other groups,
Exactly.
which plays out in different ways in how we kind of navigate the city, and how we allow different spaces to be used, or use different spaces, or how we interact with other members of society, basically.
Exactly.
So this kind of separation spatially that we see also impacts our ability or lack thereof to come together and kind of
despite different social backgrounds.
Yeah.
Whatnot. Yeah.
Anyone else?
Pratika, I have a collection of different thoughts. Not particularly to Chennai, but
please go ahead.
Yeah, it's going to be super scattered, but I'll try to I don't know, combine them together possibly. When you were talking about the initial, or towards the middle of your lecture, we're talking about the comfort human scale, right? The picture of Pycroft's or towards the third section.
Yeah.
That really brought home this idea of what if there are public spaces in a street, and then some in the area, some in the district, some in the city, which then essentially means that there would be possibly new laws which can legislate a percentage of open space for a percentage of square kilometer of area.
Definitely. So, do you want to go through all your points, or should I like address?
I'll just quickly go through a couple more points.
Okay, sure.
If you don't mind.
Sure.
Yeah, right. And I was also thinking, what if the decision-making capacity goes out of the hands of state government and goes to central government purely in terms of designating open spaces, which then means that you open up the idea to a bigger authority and not just your state.
Mm-hmm.
You're basically involving 30
to have a national policy, basically.
Exactly.
Right.
And another point possibly would be to start thinking of demolishing illegal structures, which can then you can regain your public open space such.
Mm-hmm.
And then how do you handle privatization? If government wants money, then is it possible to monetize public spaces in some way that the government is also benefited by leaving that space open? You know, if it's going to be functioning that way. And also satellite cities possibly in the future, where everything is not congested into one, 20 square kilometers of space, and there's nothing outside that.
Right, for sure. Okay.
Yeah.
So point by point. First point with regards to prioritizing public space and having like a certain kind of policy for it, whether it's at the local level or at the national level, there are provisions in our individual sort of city plans and stuff, but the planning and execution is really lacking across India. I can tell you across the board. I've been working on a project about urban governance in Delhi and Bombay, and it's all there on paper. And but again, what is on paper is not something that is derived out of consultation with the public. It is purely top down. And at the same time, the execution of of those plans as well it depends on the government officials' personal fancies, or whether rides need to be moved, to be very crude, or whether a certain contractor might be more favorable to them, and based on that particular contractor's needs, these plans might change. So if you that's noticeable, especially in Chennai, if you go like along Rajiv Gandhi Saleh, where there are different sections of that entire road which are developed by different urban design or architecture firms. So each section of the road has like different paving materials, different kind of treatment, the widths might differ, so it's very differently planned, each thing. There is no sense of standardization or of a comprehensive design strategy. It's very scattered, isolated bits of work that happens. And that happens at depending on the priorities of the government. With regards to having a central policy, I would say that actually it needs to trickle down more to the neighborhood level. I would say that, yes, there needs to be a broad national policy for sure. And then it needs to kind of get more and more concentrated as we go into each neighborhood, as we go into each building block. We do not find that kind of hierarchy of planning in India. So that kind of, and even if there is a hierarchy, there is not some kind of synchronization between the different levels. So there is definitely that gap between what one government wants and what the next layer of government wants, and so on and so forth. And there is some kind of miscommunication, infighting that keeps going on, and things don't get done, essentially. And so there is ideal scenario, all these things need to be addressed. But unfortunately, that is not the case now. Now, with regards to this privatization of public space and things like that, I know it is an important sort of source of income for governments, and it's probably the way we know to function right now. So it's not easy to just turn up tomorrow and say, hand everything back to the government. It makes no sense. There needs to be a balance, a sort of transition as we look towards other sources of income, like we are with the climate emergency that we're facing. We've known only to rely on fossil fuels, but there is a transformation happening in how we kind of use energy now, and that is necessary. Similarly, how we use and plan and kind of occupy our cities also requires a kind of transformation which gives the public a say as well. I'm not saying no, I mean, there is anti-globalization and alter-globalization. There are two separate movements. One which looks at completely rejecting the global scale and saying everything has to happen on the local scale. And the other which looks at kind of working with the system we have to make the best possible outcomes happen for as many members of the public as you possibly can. There needs to be an emphasis on how these cities are planned, because it cannot be completely regulated by the free market. It cannot be regulated by a certain section of society profiting from it and everyone else not profiting from it, which is what happens now.
Yeah.
So there needs to be a balance that needs to be struck. And that is where, planning professionals and other experts within the field have a responsibility to kind of bring forth that that need and put it make it visible to everyone, because this is something that is not commonly discussed, and it is just isolated bits of people who know about these things, and kind of other people don't really care. It's roti kapda makan every day. We need to get through every day and make a certain amount of money and feed ourselves and so on and so forth. Right now, it's all very individualized, our ways of life. So privatization may or may not be something we can avoid. But like I said, there needs to be balance.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyone else? Questions, thoughts?
It would be interesting to see a version of the popos or the pops come up in Chennai as a scheme that's balanced between like government policies and I don't know, corporates fulfilling their social responsibilities. Because I feel there's a lot of potential for that in the city, but that'll be interesting to see how that could be set up.
The balance is always very elusive.
Sorry?
In India,
yeah.
Reaching that balance is very elusive.
100%.
It's been a very interesting conversation, but personally for me, I'd like to talk about the post-COVID situation, or rather the COVID situation, because personally, for me, psychologically, I don't feel safe going out to a public space. So
I completely agree.
So even a consumerist public space, I'm okay with, because, for example, that Malaysia example that you showed, it has some kind of rules and regulations in place. But what about those spaces that have to be we were exploring only in terms of recreational or just meandering through it? So in that case, when there are no rules or regulations, how do you ensure that people psychologically feel safe? That's a very difficult question to answer. And sorry, if I may continue.
Yeah, please go ahead. Please go ahead.
Yeah, so in that case, I feel these kind of more personal level public spaces are kind of instill a little bit of more confidence, because it's at a human scale, and you have more things under your control of sorts. But there is a flip side to that as well, because there we are kind of flirting with the idea of those urban commons, which come under the prerogative of the people looking after. So those people, if they are not bound by the government or something, they can impose rules. For example, there is this OSR in OSR, which has been developed into a park, and earlier people from outside were allowed to come in, and there were no rules or something like that. But this COVID situation has kind of pushed everyone into kind of frenzied germophobia of sorts, and now people outside are not allowed. So where do we strike that balance, that elusive balance that I was talking about?
So, like I said, there needs to be a reprogramming of social behavior, for sure, especially in a country like India, where we see spitting as a common practice on our streets, or public urination happens. These are real health hazards, especially in this current situation. So, I mean, from the government end, there needs to be a definition of what kinds of social behavior is acceptable, and there needs to be a really concerted effort at creating and sustaining that awareness across different levels of society. So there has been a fairly there has been a fairly good effort made in terms of using telecom systems, internet, etc., to send out information to members of the public. But then again, that relies on the fact that every person has a mobile connection and an internet connection. And it also kind of trusts that that person has imbibed that information and will act accordingly, right? So there needs to be a more concerted effort that to make sure that awareness is created and people can understand and imbibe that awareness and act accordingly from the government end of things. And no sort of city democracy, anything of that sort is going to work unless people work as well. People, to put it very simplistically, people need to be better as well. Like I said, it cannot be only about individual freedoms in whatever situation, but especially in this COVID situation. So if people were made more aware of the fact that if you don't care that another person gets the disease, that disease could be communicated to you. That needs to be kind of conveyed. If you're going to walk around without a mask and say that everyone else has a mask, you can still contract the disease. If you're going to go around not maintaining social distancing, thinking the other person can, it's okay, the other person will get the disease. High chances that you will also get the disease. So this is something that needs to be communicated. And I think the paranoia is also a product of the kind of media sensationalism that we're subjected to. Like, for example, I had a COVID case in my house. My mother was affected by coronavirus. And in most cases, it is not something as gruesome as is portrayed. Because we had almost condolence messages every day and calls every day saying that, oh my God, don't panic, you'll be fine, you'll be fine. And my mom was absolutely fine. She had a fever for a day. But there is this kind of fear mongering and sensationalism of from the news media that kind of makes it seem worse than it actually is. I'm not saying that if you it's fine if you get the virus, not at all. But I'm saying that this kind of fear mongering not only causes individual panic, but also what to say, the way a city responds to such an outbreak is radically different, right? So there needs to be a regulation of the levels of panic. Like, we have censorship for different things, but this is not something we find censorship for, or any kind of regulation on how the messaging is put out. So that's something that needs to be regulated. And also the kind of programming that we've had through the years, where we've always gone to malls and other sanitized public spaces which have certain hygiene practices and so on. That is the kind of environment we've been exposed to, and that's the environment we consequently trust. Now, if you were living somewhere else where you know that the streets are clean, if you were living, for example, in San Francisco, you'd be fine going out because you trust that the streets are clean. This is just a distrust of social behavior from other people, as well, combined with the fact that there is no regulation or kind of importance attached to social behavior in the Indian context specifically, which is why we kind of face that fear. So that's kind of the long answer that I can give you. Basically, reprogram social behavior and increase awareness. Short answer.
Do you feel that maybe, like, I'm just wondering out loud, if a system where, like in a country like India, right, where your cities are overcrowded, like how Rohit was talking about, like smaller communities being more, like they're much more successful. The public spaces in a smaller community are more successful than in a larger city as such in our society.
Yeah.
So something like that. What if we decentralize that? What if the cities are decentralized? What if there are smaller communities that are
Yeah, definitely there is.
self-sufficient?
Yeah, there is
Yeah.
definitely increasing traction in kind of like planning cities as decentralized, like a number of villages. The approach
Exactly.
to the
Yeah.
city as a collection of villages rather
Villages.
than
Yeah.
which can rely on more self-governance and
Exactly. Yeah.
kind of being self-sufficient. Even in this
Self-sufficient,
COVID
yeah.
scenario, if you had
Yeah.
that kind of situation,
Wouldn't
you could
that
have easily
control the
closed
spread?
off and controlled
Exactly.
different hotspots, and that's how you
Yeah.
restrict that movement. And
Right.
each neighborhood could be self-sufficient.
Exactly.
So there is something called the 15-minute city being advocated for Paris right now, where every person will have to travel only 15 minutes to get anything they require, whether it is their jobs, their place of, where they reside, recreational spaces, food and beverage, whatever. Everything is to be within that 15-minute radius.
Right.
So this is something that we see growing throughout the world. There is also transit-oriented development, which looks at developing a transport corridor which connects these different neighborhoods, mixed-use neighborhoods, which is
Right.
something they're trying to implement in Delhi. But again, that's all on paper and very vague on paper right now. So,
and I think it takes a lot of effort from like on a person to person basis also to change completely from the kind of
if
system
you
we're now
had the
used to.
infrastructure, why wouldn't you? Like when you go to a European city, no one says that I want to go only by taxi. Everyone's happy to take the metro.
Right.
Whereas here, we're just used to that idea of having our own little pods of travel, whether it's our own personal vehicles or hired vehicles or whatever. That's because we don't have a strong enough transport system. Simple as that. And we have
overcrowded. It's overcrowded.
It's
rather.
overcrowded and it's not connected well enough. You don't find
Right.
connectivity between different modes of transport. So again, there needs to be a change on every level that needs to happen.
Right.
To enable this kind of creation of multiple neighborhoods.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anything else? Right, I think that's a good way to round off this discussion. So thank you so much for joining us today. Hope to see you back here with us again next month. I think next month, not sure of the date, but the last Saturday of the month is when we will have the next People for Cities webinar. The topic will be decided on the Facebook group. So I will send you all the link of the Facebook group along with the feedback form so that we can better our webinars and have you involved not only on one day of the month, but a more sort of continuous involvement. So thank you so much for joining me today and hope to see you all again soon.
Thanks, Pritika.
Thanks, Pritika.
Thanks.
Bye.